You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your PMP certification journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Risk and issue are different things, and it matters to name them correctly at the start. A risk is a possible future event that may affect objectives either positively or negatively, while an issue is something that is already happening and needs immediate handling. Framing risks as potential lets you plan responses and reserves, whereas issues demand containment and corrective action. Use this distinction with stakeholders, so conversations about contingency funding, schedule buffers, or mitigation effort are about future possibilities, not current fires. When you read this material aloud, define risk and issue slowly and clearly, so listeners internalize the difference. Much downstream clarity depends on that simple distinction. Risk management is used to reduce threats and increase opportunities throughout delivery, and you should treat it as a continuous discipline rather than a one-time checklist. The practical outcomes are straightforward. Fewer surprises because you've thought about what can go wrong, cheaper fixes because early action is less costly than late remediation, and better decisions because leaders see trade-offs with quantified potential. These outcomes arise from regular review at milestones and cadence events where new information is surfaced and assumptions are tested. Adopt risk thinking as a regular rhythm of the project, a scan and act cycle that keeps surprises manageable and the team ready to apply planned responses when triggers appear. Use risk management continuously, at kickoff to capture initial assumptions, before major integrations to expose coupling risks, and at cadence events to detect drift. Revisiting risks at milestones lets you retire those that evaporate and escalate those that grow, keeping reserves and contingency aligned with current exposure. Treat risk sessions not as blame games but as strategy discussions. What can we do now to reduce the probability or impact? And what trade-offs does that require in schedule, budget, or scope? Framing sessions around practical choices turns risk lists into decision opportunities and prevents stale registers from becoming comforting clutter. Identifying risks well begins by scanning across common sources, technical unknowns, external market and regulatory shifts, organizational changes, vendor dependencies, and compliance gaps, and by engaging diverse voices in the process. Use structured techniques such as assumption reviews, checklists drawn from past projects, stakeholder interviews, and premortems where the team imagines a future failure and works backward to causes. Record each candidate as a cause leading to a risk and then to a potential effect, and assign clear owners and observable triggers so the risk can be monitored. This causal phrasing tightens thinking and makes later analysis far more useful for action planning. Capture risks with simple, repeatable language. State the cause, describe the risk event, and identify the likely effect on objectives. Then attach an owner and one or two triggers that signal when the risk is becoming real. For example, cause, single authority API changes. Risk, API contract change during integration. Effect, system incompatibility causing delayed release. Owner, integration lead. Trigger, supplier announces breaking change in release notes. That structure avoids vague phrasing and gives the owner a clear signal to act when the trigger appears. It also makes it easy to later map mitigation steps to the specific causal pathway. Engage a range of contributors when identifying risks, because people across roles see different threat vectors. Architects spot integration unknowns, procurement sees supplier lead time exposure, operations sees runbook gaps, and compliance sees regulatory drift. Running short, focused interviews with these perspectives produces a richer register than a single brainstorming session. Rotate facilitation and anonymize initial capture if psychological safety is a concern so quieter voices contribute. The broader the set of inputs, the fewer blind spots you'll carry into analysis and response planning. Qualitative analysis turns an unruly list of candidate risks into a prioritized set you can act upon quickly. Keep the math simple and use round numbers to avoid false precision. Assess probability and impact on a small scale, low, medium, high, and add urgency or detectability as tiebreakers. Use a simple risk matrix to visualize priorities and categorize risks into zones where immediate action is warranted, monitoring suffices, or acceptance is reasonable. Grouping risks by cause also helps reveal systemic clusters where one preventative change could shrink multiple items at once, giving more leverage for scarce mitigation effort. When you prioritize, think in terms of value at risk rather than resentment about worst-case stories. Estimate potential loss in round monetary or schedule units where possible and use that as a rough sorting metric. For instance, a high-probability, low-impact bug might be below the threshold for an expensive mitigation, whereas a medium-probability, high-impact supplier failure that threatens certification deserves attention. Update the qualitative ratings often as evidence accumulates. Probabilities can shift rapidly, and reassign priorities accordingly so your mitigation funds and focus follow current exposure, not outdated fears. Detectability and urgency are practical multipliers in the qualitative step. A high-impact risk that is easy to detect and trigger early needs a different posture than one that is stealthy until it's severe. If a risk has poor detectability, invest in early warning signals or monitoring to improve response time. If it's urgent, assign immediate short-term containment, even while longer-term mitigations are designed. Always record why a rating was given so later reviewers understand the assumptions. That transparency prevents heated re-argument when the risk later materializes or fades. Planning responses requires naming strategies for threats and opportunities and defining clear triggers, budgets or reserves, and verification steps so the response is measurable. For threats, say each response strategy slowly when you read aloud. Avoid, mitigate, transfer, accept, and then explain them in plain terms. Avoid means change plans to eliminate exposure. Mitigate reduces probability or impact. Transfer shifts residual risk to another party, insurance or contract. Accept means budget and monitor the residual exposure. For opportunities, the mirror strategies are exploit, enhance, share, or accept as a potential benefit. Saying these strategies slowly gives learners time to translate abstract labels into real actions. Define precise triggers that activate each response so decisions aren't made on gut feelings alone. A trigger might be a supplier delay exceeding 7 days, a defect rate crossing a threshold, or a regulatory notice raising a compliance gap. Pair each trigger with a budget or reserve estimate that reflects the anticipated cost of the response. Keep numbers rounded for clarity, small, medium, large, and note the source of contingency funding. Finally, define the verification steps that will tell you the response worked, what to measure, how long to observe, and what success looks like so you can retire the risk with confidence. When choosing between threat tactics, consider both direct cost and systemic effect. Mitigating may reduce probability but require ongoing cost. Transferring may remove operational burden but reduce control, and accepting saves immediate spend at the risk of later expense. For opportunities, exploiting may require concentrated investment to capture a large gain. Enhancing improves the odds of benefit. Sharing pools upside with partners, and accepting leaves the chance in place without investment. Spell these trade-offs out in simple scenario terms so stakeholders can meaningfully weigh the choices against schedule and budget constraints. Implementation and monitoring bring responses into the operational flow, execute planned actions, check their effectiveness, and manage residual or secondary risks that may arise from the fix itself. Treat risk responses like regular work packages with owners, start and end criteria, and explicit verification steps so they get prioritized and resourced. After implementation, measure the post-response environment against the verification criteria and record whether the mitigation reduced probability, impact, or both. If not, iterate. Also watch for secondary risks. Changes create side effects that must be anticipated and managed. Link risk actions to change control, schedule, and cost forecasts so the plan remains coherent and auditable. If a mitigation requires scope adjustment, vendor negotiation, or additional funds, route it through the normal approval channels with a concise business case referencing the underlying risk exposure. Update the schedule and forecast the moment a risk response is approved, so stakeholders always see the net effect of risk treatment. That discipline prevents surprise budget calls and ensures risk management remains integrated rather than a parallel ignored list. Report trends and lessons learned regularly and retire closed risks visibly so the team can see what worked and what didn't. This embeds learning into practice. Use simple visuals heat maps, residual risk histograms, and a short "What Changed" note for status, and publish a short retrospective on any major mitigations explaining assumptions, outcomes, and recommended permanent changes. When a risk is retired, mark it with the evidence that justified closure so auditors and future teams understand the rationale and can avoid repeating past misjudgments. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Decision trees are a visual way to lay out options, outcomes, and probabilities so you can compare paths rather than argue abstractly. Think of a tree as a set of forks where each branch names an action and its possible results. Start by drawing the decision point, then sketch branches for each candidate response, and beneath each branch add likely outcomes with estimated probabilities and consequences. Narrate each branch out loud when you present it. Name the action, say the probability slowly, and describe the consequence in round units, days, people, or dollars. This discipline forces clarity about assumptions and makes it easier to compare choices side by side rather than rely on intuition alone. Expected monetary value, EMV, converts those branches into a single comparable number. Compute EMV by multiplying the monetary consequence of an outcome by its probability and summing those products across the branch. Put plainly, EMV is the sum of outcome times probability for each path. Use round numbers in examples so listeners can follow the arithmetic. For instance, if a bad outcome costs $10,000 and has a 30% probability, its EMV contribution is $3,000. When you speak these numbers, pause slightly between stating the probability and the multiplication so the listener can track the calculation audibly. Apply EMV to size contingency and choose the economically sound response. Compare the EMV of leaving the risk untreated to the net EMV after a mitigation cost. Example, untreated risk EMV equals $3,000. Mitigation costs $1,000 and reduces probability, so residual EMV equals $500. Net benefit equals 3,000 minus 1,000 minus 500 equals 1,500, saved a clear purchase-justifying decision. Use EMV as a decision aid, not a tyrant. Always state assumptions, units, time horizon, confidence, and use round figures so stakeholders can reason with the same baseline numbers. Decision trees and EMV work best when assumptions are explicit and units are consistent. Always state the currency or time units aloud and keep probabilities simple. For example, 20%, 50%, 80%, rather than fractions that invite false precision. When branches include multiple sequential events, narrate the path step by step. Decision, chance event, consequence, then compute the path's EMV. This audio-friendly approach supports spoken delivery and helps listeners follow the tree without needing to see the diagram, which is valuable in briefings or oral exam settings where clarity matters more than raw technical detail. Use EMV to inform contingency sizing. If the top 3 risks together yield an aggregated EMV of $8,000, that provides a defensible rationale for a reserve at that order of magnitude rather than an arbitrary buffer. Combine EMV with qualitative considerations, regulatory impact, reputational risk, or non-monetary harms to produce a balanced recommendation. When money isn't the only consideration, present EMV as one axis of the decision and explain how non-financial consequences tilt the choice. That gives leaders a clear, numeric baseline, plus the context needed to accept or override the financial signal. Agile risk rhythm expresses risks through backlog artifacts, spikes, and the definition of done so risk work is visible and incremental rather than episodic. In Agile teams, risks become backlog items with acceptance criteria, owners, and small experiment spikes designed to reduce uncertainty quickly. The DoD can embed risk controls, security checks, performance tests, documentation gates, so a story is not done unless critical risks are addressed. This pattern keeps risk treatment lightweight and continuous. The team pulls risk reduction work into near-term cadence rather than waiting for a separate mitigation phase. Agile risk practice favors rapid discovery and small experiments. When a risk is uncertain, create a time-box spike to learn fast, measure a small indicator, and feed that evidence into the next planning session. Use short feedback loops and visible radiators to show whether the experiment reduced probability or clarified impact. The Agile posture is pragmatic. Reduce uncertainty cheaply and quickly, then reevaluate. Reserve heavy mitigation for risks that remain high after learning. This supports velocity while still addressing the largest unknowns early. Predictive risk rhythm uses scheduled reviews, formal reserves, and structured reporting because large, staged deliveries or regulated contexts require documented decisions and certified mitigations at gates. In predictive projects, risks are reviewed at milestones, and contingency budgets are allocated with business case justifications. Periodic risk dashboards, heat maps, and formal registers feed governance reviews where sign-offs may be needed. The trade-off is cadence. Predictive review rigor provides auditability and completeness, but can slow immediate response unless you provision Agile-like rapid tracks for urgent risk treatment. Hybrid approaches combine cadence reviews with governance checkpoints so the team benefits from quick experiments while still producing the documented evidence needed for major handoffs. In practice, run sprint-level risk hygiene for rapid mitigation work and parallel stage-gate reviews for regulatory or contractual milestones. Keep artifacts current by linking sprint outcomes to milestone-level summaries, allowing auditors to see both the rapid learning cycles and the formal decisions without duplication. Hybrid rhythm gives you both speed and defensibility when different stakeholders require different levels of assurance. Early warning signals are the practical sensor suite that lets you detect growing exposure before a risk becomes an issue. Pick simple, observable indicators tied to the risk's causal chain. Examples include growing WIP or queue lengths for processes, sudden defect spikes in a subsystem, repeated slipped handoffs at a boundary, vendor responsiveness degradation, or changes in regulatory guidance language. Each signal should map to a trigger you defined in the risk register so teams know when to escalate. Invest in pre-specified, low-cost checks rather than elaborate detection schemes that are hard to sustain. Visualize risk burndown and heat maps to make trend following straightforward for stakeholders. A burndown chart for risk exposure plots aggregated risk points over time so you can see whether mitigation spend is shrinking exposure. Heat maps color code risks by probability and impact so clusters jump out. Link visuals to owners and triggers so a single glance answers who is responsible and what would cause immediate escalation. Use these visuals in cadence meetings to convert abstract lists into a measurable program of risk reduction with clear owners and timelines. Convert stale assumptions into explicit risks and then into issues when they materialize. Assumptions with no checks are latent hazards. Periodically run assumption reviews focused sessions asking, what are we assuming about X, and convert any critical assumption lacking validation into a risk with a trigger and short experiment plan. This practice short-circuits surprise because you're proactively turning what was implicit into something you watch, test, or mitigate. When an assumption fails, escalate it immediately as an issue with an owner and a containment action rather than letting it silently erode plans. Scenario: you face two mitigations for a mid-impact supplier risk, and the schedule is tight so prolonged mitigation may delay the release. Option A, apply mitigation 1, a low-cost fix that reduces probability from 30% to 20% but leaves moderate residual impact. Option B, apply mitigation 2, a higher-cost approach that reduces probability to 5% and lowers impact significantly but requires a month to implement. Option C, accept the risk. Set aside a contingency equal to the EMV and proceed with the release. Option D, split effort apply. Mitigation 1 now and plan mitigation 2 post-release if signals worsen. I'll give you a moment to consider that. The best next action is to compute EMV for each option and prefer the economically justified path while weighting schedule and compliance constraints. In many tight release cases, Option D, a staged approach, is often optimal. Apply the low-cost mitigation 1 now to reduce near-term exposure and monitor agreed early warning signals, keeping the more intensive mitigation 2 as a contingent plan triggered if the indicators worsen. This preserves release momentum while not abandoning rigorous protection, and it buys time to secure funding or vendor support for the larger mitigation. The strongest distractor is Option B alone, because the month-long delay may violate downstream commitments and costs that exceed marginal benefit in the short window. Option C, pure acceptance with contingency, is valid if EMV is low and the organization prefers speed, but it requires explicit authorization and a clear contingency source and triggers. Option A alone may be insufficient if the residual exposure still threatens critical outcomes, using A as part of a staged strategy with monitoring and predefined escalation to B balances speed and prudence. Document the decision, the EMV calculations, the triggers, and the monitoring plan in the risk log, so the choice is auditable and reversible if conditions change. Common pitfalls in risk practice are avoidable with discipline. Confusing risks with issues, implementing responses without defined triggers, and ignoring upside opportunities. Treat risks as potential, issues as current, and ensure every response has a clear activation condition. Implementing mitigations without triggers wastes funds on never-realized threats. Conversely, ignoring opportunities means leaving potential upside on the table. Guard against checklist box-ticking by asking whether each register item has an owner, trigger, and clear verification criteria. A short, usable playbook keeps risk work practical. Identify broadly using cross-functional techniques. Qualify quickly with simple probability/impact heuristics. Plan responses naming triggers, owners, and rough budgets. Implement actions as resourced work packages. Monitor via early warning indicators and visual burndowns, and on closure document lessons learned and retire the risk visibly. Use EMV when monetary stakes matter, and always state assumptions aloud for auditability. Repeat the cycle frequently, so risk management is a living practice that reduces surprises and increases opportunity capture over the project's life. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.